Hello, and welcome to the Food and Beverage COVID webinar. My name is Andrew Gonzalez. I will be moderating the panel today. I am the Implementation Resources Design Manager here at Fairtrade USA. I've been with the organization for 3 years and helped with a lot of our resources getting implemented to the field. But I wanted to introduce the webinar just a bit. You know, COVID is a reality in our world. It has touched many of our lives individually as well as communities and nations. And this webinar is to talk a little bit about how it's affected Fairtrade USA supply chains, how we've seen some of those effects happen, and how Fairtrade USA has responded and helped support producers globally to deal with this pandemic, right? So we've done some higher level things like establishing a task force, adapting our program, collecting data with the survey results that you will see later on in this webinar. And we conducted 2 surveys, one in April, one in July. We'll talk about differences that we're seeing in the results of that data. And we just wanted to record this webinar to talk about the results of that, the global impact, and give you information around, you know, how this is affecting people in the field, how is this affecting the market, and more. So without further ado, I'd love for the team to kind of introduce themselves, give a little blurb about themselves, and we'll get into the data.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Jackson. I am on the producer services team, and I have been with Fairtrade USA for 4 years now, working very closely with producers, mostly in the US, but also in Mexico, to really understand the impact of this pandemic on their production and on their workers.
And I'm John Goad. I'm also on the producer services team. I've also been here about 4 years. My focus is on the producers focused in Asia, especially coconut, tea, herb, and spice farmers and farm workers. Happy to share more about COVID-19 and how it's impacted our producers.
Hi, my name is Molly Ronaldo. I'm a partnerships development manager on our packaged goods team, which means I support the brands that are choosing to source some or all of their ingredients on fair trade terms and help connect them back into their supply chain, as well as share their impact and their commitments with their consumers.
Hi, I'm Pablo Granados. I'm in the produce services team as well, working with seafood. I'm the fisheries and aquaculture coordinator, overseeing supply chains from the United States all the way through Chile, and I'm happy to share experiences with everyone.
Hi, Danielle Spencer here. I'm on the Fresh team, and I work to support our brand partners in the produce, floral, and seafood industries and help on the market side with fair trade sales.
Hi, I'm Priyanka Amin. I work on the Impact Research and Learning team on our data and analysis. I actually can walk us through the survey results from both the July and April surveys. So as Andrew mentioned, we'll be sharing results at an aggregate level from both of our surveys and then really digging into agriculture and seafood, which is our focus for today. So across the April and July surveys, we saw 126 organizations, farms, cooperatives, factories, and fisheries respond across 27 countries. In both months, the leading responses came from organizations in India and Mexico. And both surveys had a similar breakdown across our 3 main categories. So that would be factories, agriculture, and seafood. For factories, we see about 55 to 59%. Agriculture is about 1/3, and then the seafood responses came in at about 8% for July. Looking at the results across these 2 surveys, those reporting decreases in demand has really started to level out by mid-July compared to mid-April. So though we're still seeing a majority reporting reduced demand since mid-April at 55%, it's an improvement compared to the start of the pandemic, where we saw 2/3 with reduced demand. This dip in demand is most severe for the apparel and home goods factories we certify, 85% of which experienced a drop in demand in April, compared to about 2/3 in July. And the increase in demand we're seeing is primarily driven by produce farms. These fair trade certified organizations, including their farmers, workers, fishers, have really had to adapt their way of life and way of working drastically to meet this moment. Government safety restrictions are in place across supply chains and countries. This includes social distancing, school closures. 80% of the organizations that responded said schools were closed in their local areas, all but in China and Thailand. And this also includes restricted travel for both public transportation and for commercial travel. And then similarly, fair trade certified organizations have had to adapt their operations to keep everyone safe. So we see back in April, 80% of organizations implementing at least 4 or more safety measures. By mid-July, 95% of the organizations responded with implementing more than 4 safety measures. So we see almost nearly all of our organizations really ramping up their safety precautions. As a result of these government mandated restrictions and implementing safety measures, we saw quite a few organizations shutting down production. This was disproportionately affecting factory workers as governments mandated operational closures in countries like India, Sri Lanka, where many of our factories are located. 50% of the factories reported closing at some point since the outbreak, compared to only 11% of agricultural orgs and 29% of seafood organizations. And those organizations mainly closed their operations briefly for cleaning. Overall, 35% of the fair trade certified orgs we surveyed shut down since the start of the pandemic. And while they're up and running again, only 3% are operating at their full capacity, compared to 22% of the organizations that never shut down. And across the board, we can see farms, factories, cooperatives, and fisheries are operating at reduced capacity, and in many cases with smaller workforces compared to the same time last year. So if we now click down a level and look specifically at agriculture and seafood organizations, we're really going to be talking about groups comprised of hired labor farms, so tea estates, produce farms, smallholder farmer organizations like cocoa cooperatives, and seafood producers like wild capture fisheries and aquaculture farms. Looking at agriculture and seafood organizations, we can see the same trend is represented. A majority are operating with reduced capacity. 80% are operating with below their full capacity, but we can't necessarily say that this reduction in production capacity is because of demand. You'll see on the right, those operating at 100% of their full capacity see decreases in demand, just as those operating with less than their full capacity see increases in demand. So we can dive into some of the factors that may be creating this reduced production for each sector. For hired labor agriculture, in this case produce farms, a potential factor contributing to the reduced production capacity are workplace safety measures that are being implemented. So 100% of produce farms are implementing some combination of these following safety measures we see here: distancing workers, extra hygiene. But in the qualitative responses in our survey, predominantly from Mexican and Latin American produce farms, we heard strict government mandated safety measures and requirements pose challenge to pivoting and continuing operations. So in some cases, this included creating defined schedules, implementing barriers, distancing on and creating shifts. So implementing these measures can translate into reduced hours and reduced production. For the smallholder farmer organization context, we saw that reduced capacity is tied to restrictions in transportation at government levels that we heard about before. 3/4 of the smallholder organizations surveyed reported having transportation issues that pose threats to moving product during and after the harvest, and unavailability of transportation also made it difficult to hire workers for the harvest. Additionally, all the groups that we surveyed reduced worker hours or hired more workers in processing facilities to adjust for safety measures that needed to be implemented, which is related to slowed production, similar to the produce farm. Fisheries and aquaculture are experiencing reduced production capacity as a result of a few reasons. So we see stagnating or reduced demand overall, which may be leading to some of these delayed and canceled orders and day-to-day cash flow issues, which seems to be heavily tied with the shift from and reduced demand in food service when the time of the coronavirus hit, and lots of U.S. consumers no longer needed restaurant orders. And so shifting operational logistics towards the retail sector has taken some time, and it's taken time for production capacity to catch up. Regardless of this reduced capacity overall, it translates into the same challenge for workers, farmers, and fishermen. It means reduced income. This reduced income is coupled with a lack of transportation that we've heard about that really restricts migrant workers from being able to return to work, and farmers from having the needed resources and labor for having their harvest. So given the transportation issues and reduced demand, there's just less work and less income overall. It creates some concern over a lack of money being sent back home and ability to afford food. And then on top of it all, just ongoing concern around medical attention and healthcare if the virus is contracted, and lack of testing and sufficient PPE in preventing the spread in home communities. But it's positive to see fair trade premium, which is the money that is sent back to farmers, fishers, and workers to democratically spend, has been made available to address emergency needs relating to COVID. And we've seen nearly 70% of the fair trade committees at these groups have spent or have concrete plans to spend this premium to address these challenges. You can see over 3/4 of these groups have spent their money on food items or cash distributions, items to address basic needs or supplement lost income.
All right, thank you so much, Priyanka, for all of those, all that slide, all that data, really interesting information and trends coming up from some of the surveys. What would you think is maybe the most compelling takeaway from all of these slides that are important for people to walk away from this data with?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to see that switch between the fact that demand hasn't necessarily fully decreased in all cases, but we're still seeing that operations aren't back fully running because organizations have to really change a lot of aspects of their logistics to meet the moment. So regardless of demand, we're going to see that COVID is going to present a challenge for a continued amount of time, and reduction of wages and income is going to continue to be a challenge for the beneficiaries we serve. And so fair trade premium is really uniquely positioned to fill that gap, which I'm sure my colleagues will be able to speak to more.
Yeah, no, thank you for that answer. I think that's a great segue into some of the topics that we're going to get into, right? So turning it over to my panel of esteemed guests, the first question that I have is actually directed towards more of the producer services teams. So kind of rolling back the time scale, let's talk about March and April, right? What were the first challenges that you started to see in your supply chains? And for sake of cadence, Pablo, maybe you can answer first, and then Jennifer can go, and then finally, John.
Sure, thank you, Andrew. Well, most of seafood supply chains stopped producing because of government recommended health implementations and some confusion around where these applied or not. In addition to that, others stopped fishing because processing plants were shut down. Another factor that affected everything was the lack of transportation of seafood from origin to final consumers. And I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer.
Yeah, so we saw a few different challenges. Really the first major challenge that we saw both in the survey results, but also by picking up the phone and calling our producers, was really there's a lack of information, and there was a lot of confusion about COVID, both at the farm level and at the worker levels. And this confusion was about the Fair Trade Program and the requirements around the Fair Trade Program in this time of crisis, but also just generally about the pandemic. So we also found there was, a PPE shortage, and they didn't know where to get PPE or how to keep their workers safe. There was also a lack of information There was a lot of information that was going around that was incorrect. And then there was some information that was coming from governments that was correct, but it was kind of drowned out with all of the plethora of information coming from all of these different sources. And then finally, it was also really trying to figure out how to quickly pivot and decide whether to stay open, to shut down productions, how to keep their workers safe. If they didn't close, what were the safety precautions that they needed to take? And if they did close, then for how long and what they need to do so that they could ensure that they could reopen safely.
That makes a lot of sense. John?
Yeah, in Asia, in tea and coconut producing communities, we saw governments as early as February begin to take some really important precautions to prevent the spread of the disease. Unfortunately, those precautions also directly conflicted with normal business operations. So they made it really difficult for producers to continue to meet demand and operate as normally. Jennifer mentioned the lack of PPE, which was a really big problem in Asian supply chains as well. In Asia, we also saw public transportation being shut down in February and March, and that caused limitations on freedom of movement, more broadly speaking. So farmers couldn't sell their products to processors anymore, and workers couldn't get to work, and exporters couldn't make their shipments. So suddenly you started seeing significant delays both in production and in shipping and delivery.
Great. No, thank you both. That was a wonderful round of responses. For those of our colleagues maybe who aren't familiar with maybe a couple of terms that we're throwing around, when we say PPE, right, we mean personal protective equipment. So bandanas, masks, other goggles or other equipment, gloves that might be necessary for workers or farmers to use to make sure that they're safely conducting their jobs. Thank you all for your responses. So moving forward, and I guess pushing the clock up to August, right? We've seen a little bit of the data, right, from the second survey, and seeing kind of what's happening somewhat. But what is the update that you can give in your supply chains in terms of what's happening now? Can you speak to any regional differences, perhaps? Maybe this round we can go Jennifer, Pablo, and then John.
Yeah, so for the most part, at this point, farms have adapted with new safety measures. They've kind of redone all of their safety protocols to make sure that they're keeping their workers as safe as possible. We are finding, though, that they may be having to change their operations a little bit. For instance, instituting different shifts to reduce overlap between workers or between different crews. Really trying to keep workers kind of within their bubble, so making sure that break areas and break rooms and whatnot don't have overlapping crews. They may be shifting lunch hours, things like that. Instituting daily temperature checks and and they may also not be hiring quite as many people to reduce to be able to implement social distancing. Especially we see this in pack houses and anytime there's indoor production. Making sure that workers can be 6 feet apart means that you may have fewer people on a production line, which then may reduce the output, right, in the production, because it's not easy to just add a production line. We're also finding that farms that rely on migrant workers, it can be really tricky to have them on the farm because either some migrant workers actually kind of got stuck in the place that they were working and they weren't able to return home safely, and there's a risk there of causing the outbreak to spread to these communities of origin. Or workers or farms that were relying on workers to come once the pandemic hit, those workers may not have arrived at all. Or some farms are just opting not to utilize their worker housing because of the increased risk of infection in worker housing, and also just the increased compliance costs of having to comply with COVID safety regulations.
Got you. A lot of factors to keep into play, needless to say. Pablo, your thoughts?
Sure, it's been very similar to what Jennifer was mentioning. There have been changes in staff at processing plants. Several plants have sent home people who are older than 60 years, people who they see that they're at risk. and there's now a reduction in the staff capacity and allocation. There was also a market shift, a decrease in the food service sector while it increased in the retail sector. That's to say, or in other words, there has been a demand reduction from restaurants and other food service providers, and there has been an increase in supermarkets and grocery stores.
And then where possible, people are starting to develop new processes and use new kinds of personal protective equipment to get back to work. We've seen a lot of really creative planning and thinking to make sure that workers and farmers can operate in close proximity to each other. So in tea, this can be things as simple as making sure that tea pluckers and field workers are operating in separate labor lines so they're not too close to each other. In the coconut industry, we've seen processing facilities actually purchase their own vans, which allows them to get workers to work safely without having to take public transportation and expose themselves to a lot of other people. It also allows them to screen for COVID symptoms and temperatures before workers get to work and avoid any infections or outbreaks at the workplace. We've also seen supply chain partners offer really important support to producers and processing facilities who are experiencing higher input costs related to providing PPE and offsetting lost income for workers and farmers. So we've seen that through importers and brands offering additional access to credit, and in some cases even paying for PPE directly. So those supply chain examples of supply chain solidarity have been really important over the course of the last 4 months.
Wow, great response. Yeah, I think it is a heightened environment of just the fragility sometimes of these global supply chains and how markets can really shift and change, and maybe your example too, Pablo. So I guess building upon this idea of all these different factors coming into play, all these different mechanisms that producers might need to keep in mind, right? I'd love to ask the producer services team again, what are some ways that Fairtrade USA has come into play here, right? Where have Fairtrade USA been able to support kind of in navigating these waters? John, how about we'll go with you first?
Yeah, immediately one of the most pressing needs we saw facing farmers and workers was a need for immediate access to cash to pay for things like food and medicine. And farmers and workers and fishermen have access to something called Fairtrade Premium, which is an amount of money that usually funds community development projects. Given the kind of emergency needs that were associated with a pressing need for a lack of an infusion of cash, we made our premium spending rules more flexible, which allowed farmers and farm workers and fishermen to receive cash as a direct cash transfer rather than through community development programs, allowing them to immediately purchase food staples and medicine and other important things. So that was a really we've heard from a lot of our partners that this was a absolutely critical stopgap when they needed money most.
I could only imagine. Jennifer, do you have any commentary on your farms, in fact, or farms?
Yeah, absolutely. So typically Fairtrade relies kind of on worker gatherings to ensure communication and transparency around how Fairtrade Premium is invested. So as John mentioned, we made those premium rules more flexible in order to be able to kind of rapidly get that cash to the communities and the workers that really needed it. And another goal of that was really to reduce the burden of compliance and implementation of the program by allowing flexibility for those activities. We didn't want anyone putting anyone's lives at risk or any of their workers' lives at risk by requiring them to gather to approve on those premium spending processes. So we reduced the burden of compliance by kind of flexibilizing those processes and kind of postponing some activities that were not kind of critical to dealing with the pandemic right away. And then in order to respond to the issue of misinformation that we found, we actually created a landing page with resources for farms that included safety protocols, updates on local regulations, et cetera, for farms to use to be able to draw from and put together their own safety protocols. And then in order to address the misinformation at the worker level, we adapted our training content and methodology and produced a video about how COVID spreads, the symptoms, and how you can prevent it. And that was actually disseminated to workers using tablets, so they wouldn't have to gather in a large crowd to get trained, but they could watch it in small groups of 2 or 3 in order to make sure that they had access to the information that they needed to be able to protect themselves. And then in addition to that, we provided mental health resources to both employees on farms and workers to help them address the stress and anxiety that was caused by all this uncertainty and the pandemic in general.
Wow, what a fantastic use of technology and kind of really pivoting in a time of change. Pablo, do you have any comments from the seafood side of things?
Sure, and just complementing what John and Jennifer have mentioned, for seafood, Fairtrade USA offer more flexibility for premium plans, most of which included investments in food and medication that were emergencies very needed during these times. Fairtrade USA also provided flexibility around holding group meetings until it was safe to do so. We were also able to provide education materials on how you could first understand what the pandemic was about, and then how you could prevent from getting the coronavirus.
Great, yeah. And I guess just to add context for our audience, in case maybe you're a little bit confused, maybe you heard about flexibility and around these processes around group gatherings. To just briefly explain, there are many aspects of the Fair Trade program or steps involved in which workers or producers or fishers are brought together into one space to come together in a democratic way to make decision making around how premium is spent, how these additional funds are usually distributed amongst their community. And so part of this flexibility that you're hearing is exactly what formats those have to happen in. Typically there are larger group settings with dozens or maybe even hundreds of individuals in one place. And so great to hear that the seafood program has been able to be flexible in that aspect and really keep funds and keep benefits going back to these communities that need them. Priyanka, you mentioned that we saw some reporting, some increased demand in the survey. Can someone tell me a little bit about what, if any, of the challenges that might be associated with that increase in demand? I think it's noteworthy to say that there was roughly, I think, about a 20% increase since the survey went out in mid-April.
On the one hand, it's a huge benefit to see increased demand during a crisis like this, since increased demand means increased sales, means increased investment into communities and more cash flowing into producer communities. On the other hand, increased demand at a time when we're seeing, limited transportation, slowed production, port closures, it creates a significant backlog of purchase orders, and we see a lot of brands, importers are having trouble actually filling their demand. Receiving the supply that they need in order to meet their demand from consumers and upstream supply chain partners. So it's a boon, but it also is a significant source of challenge for processing and producing communities.
Yeah, and similarly, for produce, unfortunately, we can't just flip a switch and suddenly have more berries or more apples available. A lot of times production is planned a year out. And so it's not always possible to just increase production suddenly, especially when you are dealing with a labor shortage, which this pandemic, there was already a labor shortage happening, and this pandemic really exacerbated it in that workers are either sick or they're choosing to stay home if they're able to afford it economically, of course, because they just are afraid of getting sick.
No, that makes a lot of sense around some challenges in that aspect. So I guess now pivoting a little bit from that question on the increased demand, I think that brings us very nicely into talking more about the market side and the brand side of things. So looking to you, Danielle and Molly, what are you hearing from your brand partners, right? What are some of the challenges that you're facing? Maybe Danielle can go first and then Molly.
Yeah, so this is obviously a time of uncertainty, like the industries I work in, the produce, floral, and seafood industries have really never experienced before. But the marketplace itself has been its own completely unpredictable thing. Partners, just like the rest of us, have had to take this on a month-by-month or week-by-week basis with their planning. And for the produce category specifically, retail demand has remained high. Produce retail sales have actually gone up year over year since the pandemic began, though, as I believe we've already mentioned, food service has taken a huge hit for our partners who work in that sector. And we know that some products have struggled significantly more than others. What I've seen that's been really encouraging through all of this is that our partners and many industry leaders have chosen to stay the course with their sustainability and their social responsibility efforts. And brands are adjusting timelines here and there, but they're keeping very close to the projects that we were managing with them towards sustainability. And I see that as a sign that the industry is really committed to increasing sustainability and do view it as a necessary part of our future.
Yeah, similarly on the packaged goods side, so when we're thinking about things really in the CPG, consumer packaged goods realm, there's a difference that we are definitely seeing the line in the sand between single ingredient products and multiple ingredient products. So single ingredient products flew off the shelves. A lot of these were our baking ingredients. For a long time, you couldn't get flour, you couldn't get sugar, because people were stockpiling it. And so while those brands, again, we're seeing this great demand, as John alluded to, demand is sales, and that's awesome. But trying to get that certified product from origin was really a challenge. And so that's been a hardship that they've really had to bear. On the other side, when we're looking at multiple ingredient products, specifically on the fair trade ingredients that might be going into those, they saw a slight rise in demand, nothing really out of control like we saw in single ingredient. But the challenges here were many of these partners that we have are sourcing smaller quantities than our single ingredient brand partners are. And so in many instances, they're getting prioritized lower than those larger quantity shipments are. So again, they're also matching the same challenge. But I will echo what Danielle said. I think the most encouraging part of all of this working with brands is they're not only committed and really seeing the true value in fair trade and having that supply chain resiliency partner, but they're also now having to field a lot of questions from consumers who are all of a sudden really concerned and want to understand more about all of the hands that are touching their products within their supply chain, and being able to have something like fair trade to provide that little bit of backup for them has been really important.
Great points from the both of you. So I guess just following up and building off of that, right? Like, what are some opportunities that brands, that consumers can do to support farmers and workers on the ground? You know, what is it that these people can actually do?
Yeah, so I think it's clear at this point that people are seeing now more than ever how interconnected our worlds really are. And as Molly was just saying, there's a clear growing desire for more awareness on where our food comes from, but also the health and well-being of those who produced it, right? So it can sometimes be easy for us to take certain things for granted, like maybe access to the internet or even access to running water. And in many of the producer communities that we work with, these are just not so easily accessible. So just imagine needing information about COVID, or even just needing to wash your hands under the circumstances we're in today, and not having easy accesses to these resources in your communities. And so these are some of the reasons that we see COVID adversely affecting the most vulnerable communities in the world. And that's why we're saying fair trade now more than ever. So for consumers, if you're hearing about the news about these issues and you're looking for a way to act, you can be looking for the fair trade seal in your purchases. And that's a way to do your part and help these communities really defend themselves against COVID. And fair trade purchases, every single one of them are sending those extra funds, those premiums that we've talked about, to these communities. And they're using these funds, as Producer Services has shared today, to offset decreased income or purchase staple foods or provide PPE, support with healthcare, and a lot of other examples that we're seeing. For the brand side, it's important to continue to support this work, not only for the safety of their workers, but really for the resiliency that a safe and healthy workforce can be adding to all of our supply chains. I want to encourage brands right now to work with your sales teams, work with your marketing teams, reach out to your fair trade reps like myself and Molly and the rest of us here, and share the stories you're hearing today of that fair trade impact, not only to your retail partners who already support your fair trade programs, but to those who don't as well. It's really by continuing to support each other that I see us as getting through this thing with the food system still intact.
Yeah, and Danielle put that really beautifully. I think just one thing to add to that is nothing unites us like a common enemy, and this virus has really become a common enemy for communities throughout the globe. And so even then, we are seeing this just general come together of globalization, and fair trade has become a really great conduit to build those bridges, as Fair Trade USA was initially conceptualized and created to be, was a bridge between producing communities and markets. And so, as Danielle said, it's time for consumers to really seek the seal, to put the pressure on their favorite brands who aren't fair trade to pursue fair trade certification, and on brands to continue to tell that story and continue to drive impact through their consumer base and drive sales via their consumers. I think one piece, as many times as we say, seek the seal and vote with your dollar, is it's not only premium that every purchase you sends back this money that goes into a bank account owned and operated by your farmers and workers that they then get to choose how they use to develop their communities. But there's also certain commodities where we've instilled minimum prices. So ensuring that in good times and in bad, like global pandemics, we have that floor that's saying you cannot buy on fair trade terms lower than this price, because we know that farmer and worker and fisher communities need at least this price. And so there's a lot of those mechanisms that you don't even notice that you are driving impact just in your purchase of a bag of coffee or a chocolate bar. You're doing so much just in a few small purchases. So it's really important to continue driving that good through that.
Wow, no, thank you from the both of you. Very eloquently put, of just how people can do more. And so I guess I'll say with just kind of one final question, like, you know, what do you think that we have learned from our partners who have, you know, leveraged fair trade in the middle of this pandemic?
I can answer that. I think even as fair trade staff, we've learned so much about fair trade, the entire fair trade program and network, and the value of fair trade through the pandemic. Pandemic has shown some cracks in our system. It's shown some additional ways that we can support producers. On farms that are required to have personal protective equipment already, that require health insurance, we've seen a higher degree of resilience to the pandemic. We've seen some certified farms that are much better equipped to communicate with their workers because they already have systems in place vis-a-vis fair trade. One great example of a way in which fair trade helped create resilience in producer communities is in our fair trade coconut communities, in which a lot of times they actually already had calamity funds. This is an amount of money that producers had set aside for a typhoon or a natural disaster or some other big shock to the system, so that they would have money to offer critical resources and rebuild in the event of a disaster. And so they were actually able to use this calamity fund to fund their COVID-19 response. So, a learning from us is that we should be encouraging more and more producer communities to also emulate this and establish a calamity fund of their own. There's so much value in being fair trade certified, and there's a lot of things that we can continue to encourage producer organizations to do as a result of the learnings from COVID-19.
Wow, very, very aptly put. I think John really summarizes, a lot of our thoughts here on the panel and here at Fair Trade USA. As moderator, I think I'd like to wrap up and thank everyone. If there's feedback from the audience, where should people email and send it? Well, they can send it to info@fairtradeusa.org. Once again, that is info, I-N-F-O, at fairtradeusa, all one word, .org. You can follow up there for any additional questions or ways to connect with us. And with that, I'd like to once again thank our panelists, thank them for spending their time to bring us their expertise from the field, for bring us their expertise from the commercial side, and really speak to how Fair Trade USA is making a difference in so many communities across the globe. And of course, thanking our wonderful Priyanka in running the numbers and really showing us the statistical backings to a lot of the stories that we heard today, without which, we couldn't tell as great and as compelling of a story. So thank you all for your time. And with that, I'll call it a wrap.